Our scripture tonight is Matthew chapter 23, beginning in verse 29, and it says this: "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you'll kill and crucify, some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." You may be seated. As you're grabbing a seat tonight, the ushers are going to receive tonight's offering, and so if you have that with you, you can take that out. And as Trina mentioned earlier, tonight is the last night in this 4-week series that we've been doing leading up to Easter, a series called the Nonreligious Gospel. And if you haven't been with us, let me just explain real quickly what this has been all about. Basically, what we've been doing is looking at Matthew chapter 23, just one single chapter in the Gospel of Matthew. And this chapter happens to fall in the last week of the life of Jesus. So it's the last week before his arrest, before his crucifixion, before his resurrection. And it's something I've mentioned in the last couple of weeks, I'll mention again tonight, that when anybody has a clear sense of the future, if anyone knows what's coming in the days ahead, there's a very real sense of, or real clarity about what they need to say. And so in the last week of Jesus' life, we see him saying some things that are very specific that we should be looking at ourselves, because he's very clear about what he wants his disciples to understand. Now, Matthew 23 is also particularly interesting because it's sort of double-barreled in some sense. It's called the woe to the Pharisees because Jesus is talking about the Pharisees, talking about these religious leaders who had piled religion and rites and rituals on people that they could never live up to. They had sucked all of the life out of faith in God, and Jesus is rebuking these individuals, but simultaneously he's rebuking them and he's warning his disciples. And so there's a double-barreled aspect to this. On one hand, he's confronting these religious individuals, but on the other hand, he's speaking to people like you and I. And I'm not going to assume that all of us in the room are Jesus followers, but for those of us in the room that are, Jesus is also speaking to us, and he's giving these woes saying, you need to understand that it's a slippery slope, that really quickly you can turn genuine faith in Christ into religiosity. You can turn it into legalism, to laws, to rites, to rituals, and you can suck the life out of this thing called faith in Jesus Christ. So each of these woes, that we've been walking through these past couple of weeks, we've been looking at the woe to the Pharisee, but we've also been examining our own hearts. And we haven't looked at all of them. We've just kind of been looking at a few of them, just a few for each of these weeks. But tonight, as we come to the last one, we really find ourselves looking at an interesting one. And I say that because as the week began for me, as it does most weeks, I just sort of began to look ahead at what we were going to be talking about tonight. And at first, I found myself sort of reading this text and going, where in the world are we going to get something for us out of this? And by the way, sometimes that happens. Just so you know, I know sometimes people say, Brad, how did you see that in the text? I just want you to know that there are many times I open up the Bible and I see it and I go, what in the world am I going to do with this on Sunday? And that's sort of how I began this week. Interestingly enough, when that happens, oftentimes I just sort of sit on it, let it kind of ruminate. I sort of meditate a little bit on the passage. And as I began to do that, there were some things that started to come out of this particular text that I found incredibly challenging for me personally. In fact, I'll say this. After the last 4 weeks, tonight's message is the hardest one. It's been the most difficult one for me on a personal level to listen to the words of Jesus and apply them to my heart. So I say that to say, there's a good chance you're going to get offended tonight. There you go. I might push some of your buttons tonight. I know this has been pushing my buttons all week. I don't do that on purpose. In fact, let me just say this. It's not me. It's Jesus. And if we are Jesus followers, right? That sounds like the best excuse ever. It's not me. It's Jesus, right? But if we're Jesus followers, then we need to understand that even when hard things come from Jesus, we need to listen to them, right? Like, even when Jesus challenges us, we need to listen. We need to lean in. If we're following Jesus, we need to hear him, even when he says things that sort of run rough over maybe how we're thinking or how we're living. So with that, Jesus is, in these final days, standing in the crowds, teaching the people. And let me just recap what I read a moment ago. Verse 29, he says, "Woe to you." This is the last woe of the Pharisees. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you actors." We talked about that last week. "For you build the tombs of the prophets, and you decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we'd lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets." Now, this is kind of interesting. You kind of probably read this and you go, what in the world is Jesus talking about? Like, what is this all about? There's sort of an interesting statement. First, let's start with the last part of that. He says, you stand around and you say, we wouldn't have participated in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Like, you look back, assuming that this is something Jesus is referencing, like, in this moment, we can assume that this is something that the Pharisees have been saying all over the place. This is something that has been sort of a mantra or a campaign slogan, if you will. That the Pharisees, this group of religious political leaders, that they had been gaining authority by giving sorts of promises to the people. Things like, we will never be like the people who led you before this. We're never going to lead like they did. We'll never be like the religious leaders you knew in your past. Kind of sounds like a modern day politician, right? It's all brand new. We'll be different than anybody you've ever seen before. You can trust us. We won't be like those who came before us. Now, what those Pharisees have is this thing called historical objectivity. It's something we all have. We also say hindsight is 20/20, right? It is really easy for you and I to look back on any other person and look at their activity or their responses or the way they behaved in a circumstance and say, well, I would never do that, right? That's what these guys are doing. They're looking back at the people that came before them, and they're saying, we would never behave like them. In fact, not only are they saying that with their lips, but they're participating in something that is sending a message to all of the people regarding this. Jesus brings up the tombs of the prophets. You build and decorate the tombs of the prophets. I want to explain what he's talking about here historically. During this time period, there was a king over the region that Jesus is living in. His name was Herod. Herod was really a puppet king sent by the Roman Empire or appointed by the Roman Empire. And really, he didn't have much authority politically. He just was sort of this figurehead in the region. I think Herod was bored because Herod embarked on some of the greatest construction projects in history. Like, he was a guy that liked to build stuff. He built monuments to himself. He built monuments to others. He built homes, vacation homes. He just liked to build stuff. He just was bored because he couldn't really lead. So he was building things all the time. And one of the things that he was building during the time of Jesus, and what Jesus is referencing, one of the projects that had been initiated, were the tombs of the prophets. He had decided to build these elaborate tombs, partially to gain credibility with the people he was trying to influence, but also because he liked building stuff. He built these tombs of the prophets to bring honor to these prophets who had been unjustly killed by leaders in the past. So Jesus references Zechariah. It happens to be that the tomb of Zechariah, I've got a picture for you of what this looks like. This is the monument to Zechariah that was being built in Jesus' day. They finished it, by the way. This is just like years later, so it's a little dilapidated, run down. Not exactly the 5-star place it was originally, but this is the tomb of Zechariah, and they were building other tombs. You can sort of see that there's these other structures alongside of it. In this region, there were these monuments all being built to honor these prophets of old who had done the right thing but had been mistreated by religious political leaders. Jesus is calling these Pharisees out because he's saying, not only do you say you wouldn't be like those people, but you yourselves, you participate in this. You give money, you decorate, you're allowing people to participate in this thing that Herod's doing because you're trying to prove a point that you wouldn't have been like those that came before you. You're trying to show how righteous you are, like, oh, we would have listened to Zechariah and Jeremiah. We would have listened to Micah. We would have listened to these prophets of old. We're not like those that killed them. And Jesus says, are you kidding me? Like, how absolutely blind can you be? I mean, think about this. The very moment in which they are honoring the prophets, they're preparing to kill the greatest one of all time, Jesus himself. So Jesus is calling them out, saying, how in the world, how do you lack self-awareness with such magnitude? How in the world can you not see? Like, Jesus says, you look back and you think you're different, but you're not. You wouldn't accept a prophet today in the same way they didn't accept a prophet back then. Now, the role of prophets is a really interesting thing. In fact, I think we need to clarify some things because in our culture, the word prophet or prophecy is incredibly misconstrued, right? How many of you, when you hear somebody say that there's somebody that's a prophet or there's a prophecy, you get a little weirded out? Raise your hand if you want to admit that in church, okay? There's 3 of us that are honest, right? So oftentimes someone talks about prophecy or a prophet. Here's what I think of. This is the stuff that comes to mind. You know those people that they take years and they pour through the Bible and they link together hundreds of obscure verses and they somehow find a secret code that's been there all along. And when you put all the pieces together, the secret code points to a date. And on this date, the apocalypse is going to happen and Jesus is going to return and this is the day that it's all going to start. Somehow, this always amazes me when people do this. It always amazes me, with all the study of Scripture, they never read the one where Jesus says that no man knows the hour nor the day. How did you miss that one? Because they predict, it's October 13th of 2017. And then October 13th of 2017 comes and goes along with all of their credibility, right? Right? I mean, it's and then somehow the next year they're okay, but we found another secret code and it's actually 2019 and it's November, right? They're always building on this. And so that's kind of what we think of. We think of prophets. That's not what Jesus is talking about. That's not the role of the Old Testament prophets. Another idea in our culture that's prevalent. When I was in college, there was some individuals that used to stand on the street, a street called Mill Avenue out at Arizona State University, kind of a party zone. And I remember when I was in college, there were these guys that would go out, they put a box up, and they would stand on this box, and there were all these party goers, just pub crawling from place to place, and they would stand on a box, and they would scream at people, they would scream and preach at these people going by. And these little crowds would sort of gather for a couple of minutes, and then they would dissipate, and people would keep drifting, and another crowd would come along. And I remember my friends and I, we saw this, and we're we got to do something about this. And so we came along the back of that crowd, and we would just ask people. We would say, hey, so what do you think of this guy? And they'd say, we think he's nuts. And so do I, for a lot of reasons, right? But believe it or not, I actually agree with some of the fundamental things that he's talking about. And they would look at us are you kidding? I'd say, no, listen, I don't agree at all with his methods. In fact, I'm blatantly against what he's doing here. But there are some things of faith in Jesus that are really valuable and meaningful. And we'd end up with these really beautiful conversations. I remember hours-long conversations with people over coffee because of those moments. You know what I never did? I never went up to the guy in the box and said, hey, can we talk sometime? I realized early on, it takes a certain frame of mind as an individual to go out in public and scream at people that you don't know, right? There's just something going on. You've worked yourself up to a level where you are doing something. We're kind of okay, what's going on now? Now you're talking to people you don't know and they don't know you. That's not what the prophets did. The prophets of the Old Testament weren't just out randomly yelling at strangers who had no clue what they were talking about. Prophets of the Old Testament, nonetheless, they had a very difficult job. They were not the most popular people. In fact, Let me just say, they were people who had a great sense of self-awareness about the challenge that was ahead of them. Some of the people you see doing these sorts of things today, not a lot of self-awareness, right? In fact, sometimes you see people doing this today, and it seems like they get enjoyment out of it. Let me just say this. That's the litmus test for whether or not somebody is a true prophet or not. If they seem to be enjoying this, they're probably not a prophet. Because when you look at the prophets, they actually didn't enjoy this, yet they played an important role in people's lives. Let me just give you an example. I'm going to use Jeremiah, one of many Old Testament prophets. I want to use him as an example. But let me just give you an example of what a prophet was really like. Jeremiah, when you're first introduced to the Old Testament book of Jeremiah, you first begin reading, you realize there's a tension right out the gate. Jeremiah was called by God as a very young man, and when he was young, he objected with God. He said, I don't want to do this, right? He's like, number one, I don't have the life experience to do this. Number two, how do I know that I'm going to be successful in this? God, why would you ask me to do this? Just all of these questions, are you sure? I really don't think I have the expertise to be a prophet. And when you open the book of Jeremiah, one of the first things you see is that God begins this conversation by saying, listen, Jeremiah, I love you, and I called you before you were even born. I knew this was what you were going to do, and I called you to do this. Not only that, I'm going to be with you along the way. And so Jeremiah's like, okay, God, okay, you got me. You're going to be with me. You love me. Great. And then God adds to that, and I've got this rebellious group of people who are going to hate you, and I'm going to send you to them to bring them back to me. And he's like, seriously, is this really what this is going to be like? Like, is that it? That was the role of a prophet. Very hard ministry. The prophets spoke truth to power. The prophets had this capacity to see things that other people weren't seeing. They had this ability to call people out and allow them to turn in direction. And they didn't always make people happy. So Jeremiah, he wrestles with this through the course of his life. Through the course of his life, he's in this tension of, why am I doing this? In fact, in Jeremiah 20, there's this sort of curtain pulled back on the life and the heart of Jeremiah that I just want you to see what the life was like of a prophet. He says, "Oh Lord, you've deceived me, and I was deceived." Kind of interesting thing to find in God's word, right? "You're stronger than I, and you have prevailed. I've become a laughingstock all the day. Everyone mocks me. For whenever I speak, I cry out, I shout, violence and destruction. For the word of the Lord has become for me a reproach, a derision all day long. If I say I will not mention him or speak any more of his name, there is in my heart as it were a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I'm weary with holding it in, and I can't." So he says, listen, I'm a laughingstock, and yet at the same time, there's this thing burning inside of me. You know you've put this thing in me that I've got to do. And then he continues, verse 10. He says, "For I hear many whispering, and terror is on every side. Denounce him. Let us denounce him, say all my close friends, watching for my fall. Perhaps he'll be deceived. Then we can overcome him and take our revenge on him." In verse 11, he says, "But the Lord is with me as a dread warrior." Isn't that a great title? Hi, my name is Jeremiah, dread warrior. The Lord's with me as a dread warrior. So that's really encouraging, right? "Therefore my persecutors will stumble. They'll not overcome me. They'll be greatly shamed, for they will not succeed. Their eternal dishonor will never be forgotten." You get the point. And what a challenging passage this is, right? He's frustrated with God. God, you deceived me. Like here I am, I'm in this position and people aren't listening to me, and yet there's this message inside of me that I have to get out, and my friends, the closest people to me, they're against me, my neighbors hate me. That's the role that the prophets play. They speak truth to those that are in power. They wake people up from their slumber. They open eyes that are blind. They see what others don't see. And the truth is that nobody really wants to be that guy. None of the Old Testament prophets, over and over again, you see that all of them had this tension. All of them wrestled with these sort of things. In fact, Jeremiah, he at one point goes to the temple of God, the house of worship where people worshiped God. And he said, listen, if your hearts don't turn back to God by listening to me, God's going to actually destroy your temple, and Jerusalem is going to be eliminated. Like, it's going to be wiped off the landscape. In fact, he says, you're not the first ones to ignore God, and you're not the last ones to ignore God, but I'm just warning you, you need to listen to me. Like, God is going to level this whole place. I think it's important that we catch the irony that Jeremiah did his prophesying in the temple, which basically means this: you can have worship, and you can sing songs and make sacrifices and have all the programs and do all the things that religious people are supposed to do, and it doesn't mean you're getting it right. So Jeremiah does this, lays it out there. The people respond over and over again. They reject him. And at one point in his life, there's a group of leaders that literally, they gather, they press in around him, and they threaten him with his life. They begin to plot of how they would kill Jeremiah. That's the story of the prophets. That's how the prophets lived their lives. Like every prophet, you look at their life, and it's just one after another, that's their story. Here's what's interesting about this. When you look at Jesus, there are probably things that you like about Jesus, right? There's probably things when you look at the life of Jesus, you see things and you go, I'm going to go on a real big hunch here and say some of us in the room like Jesus. Okay, a couple of us do, right? When you look at Jesus, my guess is you probably have a lens through which you view him that you prefer, right? Like you look at Jesus, and maybe through this series, as you've walked through this, you see this sort of non-religious Jesus who's offending the religious leaders, and there's a part of you that's like, I like that Jesus. That's my favorite Jesus, by the way. The Jesus that makes religious people mad these days, I like that Jesus. So I see that lens. Or maybe you see the Jesus who, even in this series, we've talked about this, he was radically inclusive, radically accepting. He was a Jesus who was including people who were traditionally always on the outside outside, he was bringing them on the inside. And maybe there's a part of that. You go, man, I love that about Jesus. Or maybe the words of Jesus, they resonate with you. Like when Jesus approaches people who are overworked and overburdened, and he says, my burden is light. There's things about that. You go, man, I need a light burden in this world. Like I need somebody to take the load off of my shoulders. Or maybe when Jesus looks at a group of people who need a reason for being, and he says, you are the light of the world. Live your life as to shine that light before men. Maybe there's you go, man, I love that I get to live my life with purpose, and there's that part of Jesus. Or maybe there's the woman at the well story where Jesus approaches this woman who's getting water, and he says, all of us thirst, but I offer a water that quenches thirst for a lifetime. I'll give you something that will satisfy you deeply. And maybe that's what you love about Jesus. All of us have this. All of us have little things, I'm guessing, where you go, man, I really love that dynamic of Jesus and who he is. But my guess is that very few of us in the room really love the part of Jesus where he plays the role of a prophet. My guess is that there's a part that's neglected. There's the part that we don't pay much attention to. The part where Jesus is a prophet like the other prophets. In fact, there's this story, Matthew chapter 12, one of many examples where Jesus frustrates the religious leader. There's a man who has a withered hand, and healing isn't supposed to happen according to the oral tradition of the Pharisees. You don't heal anybody on the Sabbath, right? You would never want to do something like that and violate the oral tradition. So Jesus, as he's done throughout his ministry, he violates the oral laws, not God's law, but the oral laws of the Pharisees, their traditions. He violates them, offends them intentionally. He heals this man's hand, and everybody's going nuts. Like, I can't believe this. Jesus just healed this guy. Everybody else is forgetting that it's the Sabbath. But the Pharisees, they don't forget, and they get outside, and they get together, and you know what they plot? His murder. They get together and they do the same thing to Jesus that they did to Jeremiah and to Zechariah and to prophets before. They go, how in the world are we going to take care of this guy? Because this guy is messing with our lives. This guy's saying stuff and doing stuff that questions things that we're doing. And we don't like that about this guy. He wants to heal, that's fine. Just don't do it on the Sabbath. Don't mess with my little world. So in Matthew 23, what Jesus is really getting at, what this is really all about, is this charge he's leveling towards them. He's saying, how much audacity do you have that you would build these monuments to the prophets? And you would talk about how you wouldn't have done what your forefathers would have done, how you would actually listen to someone that God sent, that you would actually pay attention to them if they were telling you to live differently or do something other than what you're currently doing. How audacious can you be that you would claim that, and yet here I am standing in front of you, and this week you'll kill me? How blind could you be? How dare you? See, there's one thing I want you to understand that's very clear, something we often overlook. It's the reality that Jesus, one of the roles of Jesus is that he was a prophet. Jesus is a prophet. He's a prophet. And they're going to kill him like they've killed all the rest of the prophets. And so Jesus continues on in this. And I want to just make something really clear. As he's talking, Jesus is not berating the battered. Jesus is not, he's not shouting at the meek and the mild. He is not talking to the broken and the bruised. He's not talking to the overworked and underappreciated. He's talking to the religious leaders, the insiders, the people who have experienced grace, the people who should know what faith is all about. That's who he's talking to. And so in verse 33, he says this, he levels this accusation. Because of this, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some you'll flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town. He goes on, ends this with saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, this city that God loved, but you kill prophets. You serpents, you brood of vipers. I grew up in Arizona. I grew up in the desert. Anybody else spend any time living in the desert? So I grew up, and we were always looking for rattlesnakes in my world. We would hike and bike and fish and hunt, and I spent my life always on the lookout for rattlesnakes. And how many of you have ever encountered a rattlesnake in your life? Okay, a few of you have. It sucks, right? It's the scariest thing in your life. Imagine doing it over and over again throughout the course of your childhood. For me, that was my life. We're always looking for. In fact, my mom has killed more rattlesnakes than most people ever see in their lifetime. I'll just tell you that. Don't mess with her. She's a rattlesnake killer. She's like the rattlesnake tamer, and she happens to be right there. But don't mess with her. She'll kill you and the rattlesnake. So we grew up like everywhere we went, there was always snakes, like all the time, these snakes. It wasn't a matter of if there were snakes, it was a matter just of where they were and when they were going to bite. And as a kid, you're like, why do they hate me so much? But that's just like another thing, right? There's just snakes everywhere in Arizona. And so we were constantly seeing these things. In fact, what that did to me is it created this incredible aversion to any snake of any kind. Are you with me in this? Like, you grow up in an environment, and anything you've heard, those of you that haven't had encounters with this, anything you've heard, it's true. They are freaky, they are everywhere, and it's scary, and they'll kill you, that sort of thing. So I have this aversion to snakes, like deep, deep aversion. In fact, over the years, I've seen people, District 81 has this guy with the snakes that goes around to the elementary schools. How many of you know what I'm talking about? And like the kids, and I see people, like they post on Instagram and Facebook, their kids like with these snakes on them. I'm like, stop it. You don't know what you're doing, right? You're like misleading your children. You cannot trust snakes, right? They are the most evil, wicked, untrustworthy creature on the planet. In fact, I wanted to put a picture of a snake up here just while I was doing this, and even that freaked me out. I was like, I don't think I can handle it. Literally, when I get in the presence of snakes, I experience vertigo, like the symptoms of vertigo. I get dizzy, my palms get sweaty. I'm not exaggerating. You get the point. I hate snakes. So when Jesus calls these guys snakes, I'm like, yes, right? Like, I am with you. These guys are snakes, you serpents, you brood of vipers. There's all sorts of stuff that's embedded in this brood of vipers comment. But Jesus' critique, it means a lot, right? You are snakes. You are evil. You are nasty and venomous and dangerous. You can't be trusted. See, there's this blindness of heart. That's what Jesus is critiquing here. That's what's going on. They say, oh, listen, we always listen to what God says. And Jesus goes, no, you don't. You're wrong. If we'd lived back then, we would have listened to the prophets. Jesus said, well, then why aren't you listening to me now? If you think you're different, then why do you feel to me the feelings you feel towards me? You're just like them. You're a brood of vipers. You're snakes. I spent a lot of time in this text this week, just personally, and because of this, because I've been just thinking about this, the question that kept coming to me was really simple. Is there any place in my life where I'm saying I would never do that? Like, is there any place where I'm being a Pharisee and I'm looking at other people and the mistakes they make and I'm going, I would never do those things. Like, I would never do that. Like, things I'm ignoring or things I'm dismissing. Am I overlooking things just because it's like I'm just like into the non-religious Jesus? This week, I came home, was kind of surprised. I got met at the door by some guys, and some words came out of their mouth that I'm not used to hearing from guys. And I want to just remind you, I live in a house of women, and I have 3 daughters, and I have been living with glitter all of my life. And I came home the other night, and there's some guys in my house, and they looked at me, and they said to me, hey, we need to apologize, and we're really sorry for ruining your house with glitter. I've never heard a young man say that in my life. But I was like, oh, no big deal. I'm sort of used to it. And then one of my daughters said, no, but Dad, it's dollar store glitter. And if those of you that maybe have lived around glitter, anyone know, like you've been raising daughters, you understand glitter. Dollar store glitter has a way of getting everywhere, and at the same time, you can't get it off of anything. Like dollar store glitter is like the worst virus on the planet. And so I just kind of played it off. I was like, no big deal. It's just glitter. Let me just say, that was like on Tuesday night. All week this week, it's just been glitter everywhere. All the time. I go out back, there's glitter on our deck. There's glitter in our grass. There's glitter on the dogs. There's glitter everywhere. On Thursday night, Maddie's guitar teacher was over. Michael, he's sitting on the couch, and I'm talking with him before they started their lesson. And the guy's got glitter all over his face. And I'm just looking at him, and I thought, I'm not even going to tell him. Like, the glitter's so bad. I'm just like, we're just living with it these days. And I just thought, somebody, like his wife will tell him like tomorrow or something. She'll wake up and be like, why do you have glitter? And it'll be really awkward. Kind of play that one out. It was kind of fun. So part of me was just having fun with that, like glitter. But are there things in my life, I found myself this week saying, are there things in my life kind of like that glitter where just because it's everywhere, I'm not listening? Just because it's common, I'm just sort of ignoring, I'm just sort of dismissing it because, well, there's this love and grace and peaceful side of Jesus And really this other stuff that's being said, this other stuff, because it's so prevalent, because I'm so used to it, because it's so common, because it's just so much a part of life, am I avoiding these things that are just all over the place in my life? That's what I wrestled with. And I found myself thinking about that for all of us. Are there things even for us as a church? Remember, this is what Jesus is saying to his disciples. And he's saying, I don't want you to be like these Pharisees. I don't want you to be ignorant of these things that are going on and not listen to the words of a prophet in your life. I want you to be open to the words of a prophet in your life. So I just found myself like, what's the position of our hearts together? Are we the kind of people who listen even when there's this stuff we've been dismissing, we've been sort of ignoring? See, Jesus said things that were beautiful and wonderful and life-giving, especially to those that were on the outside looking in. But he also had some really challenging things to say. He wanted his followers to carry certain values. He wanted there to be a culture among us as his people. And so he said things in an attempt to maintain that culture. So I think about some of these things, and this week I jotted some of these stories, some of these examples down that I found somewhat challenging. And there's a lot more than what I'm going to share, but I was thinking about this one, James and John. 2 brothers, 2 disciples. They come to Jesus one day, and they walk up to him, and they have the audacity to say, Jesus, we want you to do everything that we ask. And Jesus is like, okay, go ahead. And they said, when your kingdom is established, when the culmination of all that you've promised comes true, will you let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left? Will you let one of us be at your right and another? In other words, what they were saying was, Jesus, when you find success, when you reach the pinnacle, when your kingdom comes, can one of us be on your right and your left? Can we experience success? I mean, we're still going to put you first, but can we be like right next to you and experience the goodness with you? And Jesus looks at him and he says, you guys have no idea what you're asking. Now, we would never do this, right? Right? Yeah, we would never, right? We would never do this. We would never go to Jesus and ask him to make us great, right? We would never go to Jesus and say, Jesus, listen, I want you to get the glory. And so if you let me get this job, Jesus, right? Or Jesus, if you just let this thing work out, I'm going to tell people, I want you're the one that's out in front, but as you lead, let's just make sure that I can get some leftovers, right? We would never do that. What would we? Yeah, we would, right? This is us. Would we ever dictate to Jesus who we're following where he should lead us? Isn't that basically what's going on here? Hey, Jesus, we follow you, but can we make some suggestions as to where you lead me? Would we do this? That's a hard thing. Jesus tells this story because that's what people do, right? Then there's this parable that Jesus tells about soil. He's describing the delivering of God's kingdom, God's word, his truth, his love, and his grace, all of those things, and how when it lands in a person's heart, it lands in a person's life, it just springs out. There's something that comes from this. Like when you receive and understand who Jesus is and his grace, there's this life that emerges. And so Jesus uses this illustration of a seed that's planted in various kinds of soil, and it begins to give life. But in this illustration, he talks about 4 distinct types of soil that the seed lands in. And at this one point, he's unpacking his illustration, and he comes to the description of the 3rd type of soil. And I want you to just listen to this. He says this 3rd soil has thorn bushes in it, and then he says, as for what was sown among the thorns, the seeds that landed among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke out the word, and it proves unfruitful. So Jesus says the kingdom, this amazing life in God, it will easily be choked out by the desires of other things, the deceitfulness of wealth, or the cares of this life. What he's saying is this, that there will be people who hear the message of Jesus and they get so enthralled and so excited and they jump all in and they're excited for a time. But then just life happens, right? And when it happens, it creeps in and it begins to choke out this life that God is producing in you. Between the shiny stuff that we're being tempted with chasing and the responsibilities of life, the kingdom of God just sort of grows dim inside of our hearts and it gets choked out. But that's not us, right? right? That's not us. We would never be these people, right? We're the fourth soil that Jesus talks about, where the seed goes in and it grows and it's all good, right? And everybody eats of the fruit, right? Or is that us? Jesus said some really difficult things, right? Like, the cares of this world are going to choke out the life that I'm putting in you. There's this moment in the life of Peter where Jesus has been captured by the Pharisees. It's just a few days after these verses we're reading in Matthew 23. He's being interrogated. He's being beaten. The disciples are scattered. Peter is warming his hands by a fire, and some people come to him and they say, hey, aren't you one of those Jesus guys? Like, aren't you into this whole thing? And Peter says, are you kidding me? I don't even know the man. We'd never do that, right? We'd never refuse our association with Jesus. We'd never keep it quiet, right? We would never sort of privately hide our faith and when somebody asked us about it. Would we? Like, if there was a fire, wouldn't we stand by that fire and say, no, I'm with him? Or this week I've been thinking about Judas for very obvious reasons. Judas had a very clear idea of what Jesus was supposed to be. And when Jesus didn't deliver on Judas's expectations, he delivered Jesus. We would never, right? Would we ever abandon Jesus because he didn't give us what we wanted? See, these are just a few things, right? These are just a few of those things that sort of stir up. And you realize, like, wait a second, this is challenging, right? This whole woe to the Pharisees, this is something that's way more personal than we imagine. Like, Jesus is calling them out, and what he's calling them out for, it isn't the fact that they would kill prophets. I want you to get this. It's the fact that they don't see, that they're blind, that they're unwilling to listen to those difficult things. It's not the fact that they will mess up and make mistakes. It's the reality that they will refuse to listen to correction. It's the fact that they'll refuse to admit that they could ever be wrong. That's what he's talking about. And so I found myself all week this week asking this: what are the prophetic words or actions of Jesus that we are ignoring or opposing today? What are the things? Like, what are the things that are cropping up around us? And maybe it's a circumstance in our life. Maybe it's something that gets taught out of the Bible. Maybe it's a friend who comes alongside of us and they speak words, and those words cause something to stir inside of us. And because of our busyness or because of our routine or because we just don't want to go there, we just simply move past and we ignore those things. And when we do, we're not listening to the voice of the prophet in our life. What are those things? Are we ignoring Jesus the prophet? Still loving the King Jesus, still loving the Savior Jesus. We can come in and we can worship and we can talk about his love and his grace. But when he comes to us and says, hey, what's going on with this? Do we just go, oh yeah, Jesus, you're not serious about that? Are we listening to the harder things? Do we say, well, I would never be like those people? And it turns out we're just like them. I want you to understand why there were prophets. There were prophets because people lose the plot. You and I lose the plot. I lose the plot. We get caught up in our lives. We get caught up in our religiosity. We have blind spots. And the prophet comes along not out of cruelty, but out of love. Jesus comes out of love. He has this desire for human flourishing. He has this deep desire for you and I to flourish on every level. But in order to do that, sometimes he says things that are difficult to receive. Are you with me? So he looks at this stuff. He looks at our lives and he goes, listen, you're chasing this and you think you want it, but you don't. He sees things that we think are going to give us life, and they're actually stealing our life. He sees the things that are consuming us, and he says, why are you letting that consume us? He sees the things we're worrying about, and he says, let me remove that burden from you. All of these things, he's saying, listen, I am more to you than a means to an end. I am not the way through which you get everything you want. I am the way through which you get everything you need. And there is a massive difference between the two. Jesus knows what we need, and that's what he's giving to us. It's like your GPS when you're getting directions and you get off course. What does your GPS do? Return to the route, right? Doesn't berate you. Return to the route. If you got the British assistant like me, it's return to the route, something like that. But You know what I mean? And what do? Oh, you don't know what you're saying. No, you listen. You listen because you realize if I don't listen, I'm not going to get where I set out to go. That's what a prophet does. If you don't listen, you are not going to get where you set out to go. You may have started with all the best intentions, but if you stop listening to me, we are never going to end in the place that you wanted to end. There's a story in the Old Testament that I think is a beautiful example of what Jesus is longing for in people. It's what Jesus desires. And what I love about this story is it isn't a story that starts with somebody who's perfect. It actually is a story that is rooted in somebody who just messed up, like absolutely blew it. It's a story of David, King David of Israel, who had this very public affair with Bathsheba. He has this affair with this woman, and let me just say, like in the time and in the place, it was completely okay for David on many levels to just sort of ignore it like glitter on a face, right? It was just sort of this thing, like, but I'm the king and I can do what I want, but there's no husband around because I had him killed in battle. I'm a person of power and I can just do this. I can do this. In fact, we live in a culture that's allowing these sort of things. And so David just sort of plows forward and he's just moving. He's had this affair and he has this now, pregnant woman that he's had this relationship with, and he's kind of processing this, but he's just sort of ignoring it, right? He's just kind of going through his days. And then there's this moment in his life when an individual comes to visit. His name is Nathan, and guess what he is? The prophet. Nathan the prophet, not this Nathan the prophet. Nathan the prophet comes to visit David. And he tells a story. And by the way, whenever a prophet tells a story, it is not for entertainment's sake. He tells this story, and by the time he completes the story, David comes to the realization that the story is about him. And what I love about it is that David's response is the response that Jesus is looking for. He immediately realizes, this is about me, and I need to listen. And so he responds with this confession. He responds by saying, you're right. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't argue with Nathan. He doesn't say, but listen, culture says this, or it's really not that big of a deal because I'm the king and God's anointed me. He doesn't give all the excuses. He just simply says, you're absolutely right. And then one of the most beautiful things, if you ever read the Psalms and you come across Psalm 51, it's the psalm that David wrote right after this moment. And it's beautiful because it expresses the reception of this word. It expresses the confession. He admits his mistake. And then towards the end, there's this absolutely beautiful thing. In verse 15, he says, "O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise." Do you see the difference in response? The Pharisees, Jesus comes and he says, listen, are you listening to me? Can you hear me? Do you know what I'm saying? And they want to kill him. Nathan comes to David, and David says, God, can I just praise you? Thank you. Thank you for calling me out. Thank you for being the kind of God that loves me enough to say hard things. And then verse 16, I love this. He says, for you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. This is so beautiful in light of what Jesus is talking about. David says, listen, I understand that right now for a lot of people, when they hear something, when they know they're out of line, when they've made a mistake and they've messed up, there are a lot of people who jump into religion, right? They jump into, okay, then I'll just obey God and I'll do all the right things and I'll white knuckle this thing. I'll hold tight to all the rites and the rituals. I'll make sacrifices and burnt offerings. David has the presence of mind to know the heart of God in this moment. He goes, you don't want that stuff. You don't want empty religion. You don't want me jumping through hoops to try to make you happy. All you want is my heart to be aligned with your heart. That's all you want. And so in verse 17, he says, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. God, you don't want rites and rituals. You want a heart that's broken. You want a heart that's hungry for your ways. A heart that says, God, your ways are better than my ways. A heart that's willing to be shaped. A heart that's willing to be molded. A heart that's willing to be formed and confronted. You know, that is God's idea of good religion. Did you know that? It's about our heart being shaped by Him. Not rites and rituals, but a heart that listens and lets Him lead. See, the issue with the Pharisees, the issue that Jesus is getting at, it was their blindness. It was their blindness. He wasn't asking them to be perfect. That's not what he's asking. He's asking them to be responsive, to listen, even when it's challenging. So tonight I want to end with a couple of questions that I've been asking myself this week. This is what wrote in my journal this week as I just sat back and thought about this. I just realized I need to I need to not always be in control. And so I asked myself, are there places in my life where I'm not listening to the harder words of Jesus? Are there things in my life that I know I've been called to and asked to do and I'm not responding? Is there anything that Jesus has said or asked, a blind spot he's revealed, and I'm resisting it? Will you pray with me right now? I think the most important thing for us is that we let the words of Jesus sink into our lives, that we don't just allow this to be a shallow teaching of knowledge that we sort of take away and say that's interesting, but that we actually pause and drink from the well of living water together. And so I'm just going to ask these questions and give you an opportunity just to think about this yourself, and maybe there's something that's just on the surface, or maybe there's something deeper that's stirred up, but I'm just going to ask this. Are there places in your life where you are not listening to the harder words of Jesus? Or are there things in your life that you know you've been called to and you're not responding to them? Is there anything that Jesus has said? Is there anything that he's asked and you're resisting it? Is there a blind spot that he's been revealing to you and you're just not wanting to admit that it's there? My guess is if you're like me, there's probably a number of things that fall into those categories. And Jesus, tonight I just ask for all of us in the room who sincerely want to follow you with our lives, who want to be serious about this thing, that you give us the courage to not be like the Pharisees and to admit our weakness and our brokenness and to listen to your words as you challenge us around the tougher spots in our lives. Lord, I pray that you give us the trust in you to believe, sincerely believe that what you hold out for us is far better than we could ever imagine, and that your means for getting there is far better than what we could ever craft. Lord, help us to trust that. And so that if we're off the mark and we're straying in different directions in pursuit of something, that we would just be nudged back by this conversation to following you. Lord, don't let us ever be the kind of people that say we would never do that. Help us to be humble and honest, to have hearts that are willing to say, yeah, I can blow it and pursue stuff. And Lord, keep us humble. Keep us chasing after you. Would you stand with me and let's make this last song that we're going to sing just a prayer and an extension of our time praying together, and then I'll come back up and close us. Tonight as you go, this week before Easter, the same week that Jesus was having this conversation with Pharisees and disciples, may it be true of all of us. May we be men and women who go into this week with the courage to admit our brokenness, the courage to listen to the hard words of Jesus, the faith to be obedient to what he says, and a grasp of his grace and his truth. Amen. Amen. Let's go be an authentic community of faith this week in our community. Sound good?